Sleepy History Tales welcomes you back, or if this is your first time hearing from us, you've probably just walked through a door that will be hard to turn back from. And today, you're about to hear one of the most deeply buried mysteries of the American West. The disappearance of the 7 Thornfield sisters, a story as chilling as the morning mist in the town of Selkerk. Part 1. The Unforgettable Morning. On the morning of October 13, 1899, the residents of Selkerk, Montana, awoke to a mist as silver as ash grey, to a scene that was beyond explanation. In the 3-story home of the Thornfield family, one of the town's most prestigious and wealthy families, the 7 beds were as untouched as if no one had ever slept in them. The covers were still neatly folded as if a dutiful servant had just left. But the room was empty. There was no sound, no footprints in the thin mist outside the windows. No windows were broken into. No doors were left open. Even the nightgowns the girls had hung up carefully before going to bed were still there. It was as if they had vanished into smoke into the autumn wind without a word of farewell. Part 2. 7 names lost in history. Margaret, 26. Catherine, 24. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth, both 22. Sarah, 20. Grace, 17. And Rebecca, the youngest, only 14. They were the daughters of Mr. Gabriel Thornfield, a merchant of great influence in the area. The Thornfields were not only wealthy, they were symbols of progress of what was called Western civilization. But after that fateful morning, the 7 girls were wiped from the world. Not a single clue left behind. Not a single object gone. Not a sound heard. The local sheriff's files, sealed by federal order for nearly 80 years, contained just one detail that no one in the investigation team dared to make public. Every room had been ransacked, but by someone very familiar with the house. And even more terrifying, nothing had been taken. No jewelry, no money, no clothes. Nothing except themselves. Part 3. And the silence of the authorities. No one in the authorities would say anything. Even Gabriel Thornfield, a father who had once rallied the state to find his daughter, was denied access to the information. And hidden in those dusty files for a century was more than the painful end of the 7 girls. It's a web of human trafficking, corruption, and greed that's woven deep into the very machines of power in the Wild West. Before we continue our story and open the pages of documents that were once sealed because they were too dangerous to publish sleepy history tales, just wants to say thank you. Those of you who are listening to this voice late at night, early in the morning, or in the middle of a sad afternoon. We know there are many of you who have silently followed every episode, every minute, every story, without ever clicking subscribe or leaving a comment. If you're one of those silent souls, let us know where you're listening from. From Texas, Maine, Saigon, or a small rented room in Athens, your words are the driving force that keeps mysteries like the Thornfield families from being forgotten. We read every comment. And if you sign up, at least you won't miss the next chapter where the truth turns darker than you ever imagined. Part 4. Selkerk, the town that glitters and decays. By 1899, Selkerk was no longer a shabby outpost. It was a thriving silver town straddling the newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad connecting Denver to Seattle. The scent of wood smoke, rotting maple leaves, and the cold metallic scent of silver ore mingled in the air. It was both addictive and sickening, like the disease causing prosperity itself. Main Street was bustling. Horse-drawn wagons loaded with ore were constantly coming and going. Businessmen from Chicago and New York stepped off the train cars with gold watches and silk scarves. Families crossed continents in pursuit of the Western dream, a place where a man's worth was determined not by blood, but by grit. But beneath the velvet cloak lies tension, lurking and vicious. The pioneer families of old are being pushed aside. Money from the East is pouring in. Miners, immigrants, hands stained with sweat and blood, stand face to face with investors who see only numbers. In the next part, we will explore the very night of the Thornfield sisters. Who was the last person to see them, what happened behind closed doors, and the suppressed testimony of the two servants. You should not miss it. Part 5. The girls who went away in tears and never came back. It wasn't the noises in the night or the strange lights in the woods that started the whispers in Selkerk. It was a much quieter loss, the young girls who had come with their families, and then suddenly left with vague goodbyes and tearful eyes. No one really knew where they went. They were just told they were back in town. Chicago, Minneapolis, Spokane. But then, no letters, no replies. No one came back. Part 6. The man who stands in the center of the town and the suspicion. As the town transformed itself into a new form, rich, modern, and filled with strangers, one name became increasingly prominent: Gabriel Thornfield. He was the epitome of the Western dream. A lone man with only a wagon load of supplies and 7 daughters huddled in the cold winter of 1892. His wife had died of pneumonia as the family crossed the wild prairies from Ohio. The sight of the man huddled around a fire in the middle of a snowstorm moved the town. They helped, and he responded with remarkable diligence. In just 2 years, his small grocery store had become the largest commercial center between Missoula and Butte. He secured exclusive contracts with mining companies, traded directly with Chicago and San Francisco, and built the most magnificent mansion in 3 counties. Part 7. Thornfield House, a castle in the wildwoods. The 3-story mansion on Maple Street, with its gingerbread arches, stained glass windows, and wraparound porch, was like a castle in the Wild West. The people of Selkerk whispered, "He works hard." But gradually the whispers changed. How did a grocer from nothing get rich so quickly? Where did the money come from? Where did the connections come from? Part 8. 7 flowers in the snow. But if Gabriel was the economic soul of the town, his 7 daughters were the beating heart of Selkerk. Each had her own unique traits and talents, but they all won the respect and love of the community. Margaret, the eldest, was a different kind of teacher. She taught her students to think independently, to ask questions, instead of just memorizing. Parents from as far away as Helena sent letters of praise. She stayed late into the evening, held enrichment classes for bright children, and never turned down poor students. Catherine, 2 years younger than Margaret, inherited her mother's talent for painting. Montana landscapes, soulful portraits, and simple still lifes hung in the bakery, the bank, and the Moyer's living room. She organized concerts, art exhibitions, and literary discussions, making Selkerk a place not only for silver, but also for culture. Part 9-2. Identical figures. 2 opposing souls. Elena Nena and Elizabeth, the famous Selkerk twins, turned their sewing skills into a miniature feminist enterprise. Their shop was more than just a tailor shop or a wedding dress shop. It was a place where women came to confide, exchange news, and help each other through the rigors of frontier life. Eleanor was outgoing and shrewd handling the business. Elizabeth was calm and understanding. Many of the town's women considered her the keeper of their safest secrets. Part 10. Selkerk's Voice and the Light of Winter. Sarah, 20, has a voice that makes churches shake as if the ceiling is about to collapse with divine light. She leads the Methodist Church choir, organizes Christmas plays, and raises funds for the families of mine victims. She is not just a voice, but a beacon of hope in a place where death lurks in every mine collapse. These girls cannot disappear like the wind. They cannot vanish like frost on a window. So who made them disappear? In the next part, you will meet Grace and Rebecca, the two youngest children in the family, an adventurous girl with an instinct for discovery, and a 14-year-old girl with more secrets than anyone could imagine. And then we will return to the house on Maple Street, where the lights have never been turned off. Until that fateful night, don't forget to subscribe if you're a silent soul listening. Silent followers are the lifeblood of sleepy history tales. But for stories like these to continue to be told, we need to hear your whispers. Tell us where you are. Have you ever heard of a town like Selkerk? And if, does the town you live in also have buried secrets? Part 11. The last two flames of the Thornfields. No one in town could deny that the Thornfields were not just rich. They were role models, humane sons in a land where winter ate away at the hearts of men. And among them, Grace and Rebecca, the two youngest, were especially fiery. Grace at 17 had a mind that baffled even seasoned accountants. She could calculate compound interest in her head faster than anyone could look it up. She could handle 3 ledgers at once without making a single mistake. A businessman once said, if Grace were a man, she would be running the state bank. Her father began to consult her on major deals. Mine owners, merchants from Chicago, were all dumbfounded when they saw a girl younger than 18 who could find errors in a balance sheet as if she were reading a novel. Rebecca, 14, is the last ray of sunshine in the Selkerk winter. She has no business mind, no drawing or teaching. But everyone who has met her remembers her. With a smile more contagious than the flu and a heart big enough to hold every child in town, Rebecca reads to the miners' children, helps the elderly choose books from the library, and is loved by all. Some say Rebecca will be a teacher. Others see her as a natural nurse. But everyone believes whatever she does, Selkerk will be better for it. Part 12. When questions begin to take shape. However, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Although the Thornfields are admired, questions begin to creep into the ears of the people in whispers. Where did Gabriel get so much money? How could a man who had come here with just one wagon build a 3-story mansion, hire workers and establish connections from San Francisco to Chicago in just a few years? From the summer through the early fall of 1899, those suspicions grew. Strange men in fancy coats were seen getting off the train at midnight, entering Mr. Gabriel's house, holding secret meetings behind closed doors, and disappearing before sunrise. Part 13. When the West was no longer a dream. The year 1899 was not just difficult in Selkerk. The country was still struggling with the economic crisis that had lasted since 1893. Banks failed, businesses closed, men lost their jobs, and frontier towns, once symbols of the promised land, were now suffocating cages. Strikes erupted across Montana, Idaho, Colorado. The miners rose up for fair wages, safe working conditions, and to be seen as human beings, not corpses in the ground. The Western Miners' Union was formed, and blood was shed in towns just a few hours' drive from Selkerk. Gabriel Thornfield, like many other business owners, was caught between two opposing forces. On one side were the poor laborers to whom his daughter sang every Sunday. On the other were the Eastern investors who demanded the highest profits, even if it meant trampling on the community he lived in. Part 14. When the railroads brought the devil. The Northern Pacific Railroad's arrival in Selkerk in 1896 ushered in a new era for the town. Money flowed in, goods flowed in, news flowed in, but it brought other things with it too. Fraudsters, land speculators, criminal syndicates travel along the rails like parasites on the economic blood. They seek out remote towns where the law is weak and the hearts of the people are easily corrupted. No one knows for sure what they do. But it is rumored that many poor families have lost their daughters, their land, their entire lives within weeks of strangers coming to visit them. Part 15. The last morning. So peaceful. October 12th, 1899. The day before the disappearance began as a perfect morning. Red leaves were falling steadily from the roofs. Smoke from the kitchens drifted through the rows of wooden houses. The sky was as clear as glass. The people of Selkerk awoke to the sound of roosters crowing, to the smell of baking bread and burning wood. And they felt lucky. Little did they know that it would be the last day they would see the 7 Thornfield flowers. The last day the town could claim to be a safe place to raise a daughter. In the next part, we'll go through each hour of October 12th. Who met the girls who entered the Thornfield house, and what was recorded or hidden in Rebecca's diary. If you've come this far and haven't subscribed, you're probably one of those quiet, loyal souls who watch every episode without leaving a trace. Leave a note no matter where you're listening. It could be from the peaceful countryside or the smoky city. We read every word, and your words help keep these stories alive. Autumn had brought out the most brilliant colors of the red maples along the town's main avenue. The morning light filtered through the yellow leaves, casting streaks of stained glass on the wooden pavement. At 7 o'clock, sharp Mr. Gabriel Thornfield, as always without fail, opened the door of his grocery store. Meanwhile, his daughters began their day in the familiar rhythm that had been ingrained in their family routine for years. Margaret set off for her one-room school at 8 o'clock, her leather briefcase bulging with lesson plans carefully prepared the night before. But today, the parents waiting outside the school gate to pick up their children noticed that Margaret seemed to be under the influence of something. Instead of her usual bright smile, she responded to greetings with absent-minded nods. Some mothers later reported that her usually neatly combed hair was disheveled today, as if she had hurried out of the house without looking in the mirror. Meanwhile, Catherine set up her easel in the back garden, where she had spent weeks trying to capture the autumn beauty of the Bitterroot Mountains. Henrietta Walsh, who lived across the street and watched Catherine from her kitchen window, noticed that the young artist kept putting down her brushes and pacing the garden like a lost soul. Catherine's eyes were fixed on the train station, and when she returned to her painting, she would only repaint the same area over and over again, as if the image in her mind was protesting against her trembling hands. Twins Elena and Elizabeth opened their dressmaking shop at 9 a.m. as usual to continue working on the elaborate wedding dress for the mayor's daughter. But instead of the usual laughter, the room was filled with tense, intermittent whispers cut off whenever a customer entered. Dorothy Fleming, who had brought a dress that needed alteration, reported that the girls were unusually clumsy, mismeasured cut wrong, and started all over again. Sarah spent the morning practicing singing at the Methodist church in preparation for Sunday service. But the Reverend Thomas Atwood noticed right away. The girl's voice, always clear, was shaky and off-key. When asked what was wrong, Sarah said only that she was a little unwell and refused both the offer to call a doctor and to send for her father to pick her up. At the grocery store, Grace helped her father as usual. But customers whispered to each other that the mathematical genius was now adding and subtracting the simplest of calculations incorrectly. Gabriel Thornfield could not hide his anxiety. He kept looking at his watch, then at the door, as if waiting for something that had not happened yet. Even Rebecca, the youngest, always chattering, was unusually quiet as she helped Mrs. Caldwell clean up the house. The housekeeper recalled that Rebecca asked strange questions. Have you ever been away? Have you ever missed your family so much that you cried? Can you live happily without all the people you love? And then, these small disturbances took on a suspicious tone. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dr. Samuel Porter, returning from a session, saw all 7 Thornfield sisters walking down River Street toward the station. The sight sent a chill down his spine. The town was too small to miss the anomaly. It was unheard of for all 7 to appear together unless there was a big festival or a wedding. But what haunted Dr. Porter most was the way they walked. Silent, stiff, with a look of desolation on their faces, as if they had just heard bad news. They walked as if they were on some terrible mission. Their steps were military, their eyes were vacant. When he called out a cheerful hello, only Rebecca turned. The look in her eyes made him choke. It was not the look of a young woman living in a peaceful town. It was a strangled, trembling, soundless plea for help. He believed that Rebecca was begging him to stop something she could not put into words. The last time anyone had seen the 7 sisters together was at 9:15 that night. Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk at the telegraph station, glanced out the window from his notes and saw them standing close together under the amber streetlight just outside his office. They did not speak, did not smile, did not look at anyone. They just stood there as if waiting for something to come that they could not avoid. Their posture stopped Fletcher mid-motion. The girls, no. The sisters stood, not as family members sharing idle conversation, but as statues in formation. 7 in total aligned shoulder to shoulder in an eerie row that faced directly toward the distant glow of the train station. They didn't speak, didn't move. They didn't even glance at one another. Their stillness was so complete, their attention so fixed, that for a moment, Fletcher wondered if he was witnessing an optical illusion, shadows thrown strangely by lamplight, or a trick of fatigue playing on his mind. But it was no illusion. Each of the Thornfield sisters was dressed not in the plain garments of evening rest or household labor, but in their finest dresses garments he had only seen them wear at church on Easter or at formal town dances. Their hair was styled with meticulous care, gleaming under the street lamp's uncertain glow. Jewelry shimmered faintly at each wrist and neck, heirlooms, brooches, lockets. Adornments that would never be worn casually, and yet their faces bore no joy, no anticipation, no pride. There was only dread and a quiet, terrible resolve. They looked like young women preparing to walk into something irreversible. By the time Fletcher glanced up again, perhaps 10 minutes later, they had vanished. Not walked away, not drifted out of sight. Simply gone as if the night had swallowed them whole. What happened next remains one of the most bewildering and heavily scrutinized stretches of time in the entire Thornfield affair. For there were no more witnesses. Only one man remained who could account for the hours that followed, Gabriel Thornfield himself. And his version of the evening, when pressed, would prove to be anything but reliable. In his initial statement to Sheriff Harding, Gabriel claimed he had retired to his study around 10:00 p.m., as he always did, to review correspondence from that afternoon's mail delivery. Letters, ledgers, and reports from his business partners out east. He insisted he had spent the next 90 minutes immersed in his work, unaware of anything out of the ordinary. Mrs. Caldwell, the Thornfields' longtime housekeeper and the only other adult in the household, corroborated part of his story. She finished her usual evening duties and left the main house at precisely 10 o'clock, heading to her small cottage at the edge of the property. But her final observations from that night proved far more revealing than Gabriel's account. She described the house as unusually quiet, not peacefully so, but eerily hushed like a church after dark. There were no footsteps overhead, no voices drifting from the upstairs halls. Even the familiar creaks and groans of the old wooden structure had ceased. The house, she said, felt, paused. More troubling still, she noted that none of the girls had prepared for the next day, something they always did with a sense of almost ritual precision. No garments laid out, no letters drafted, no supplies gathered for their various duties, as if the routines that defined their days had been abandoned all at once, like a family expecting there would be no morning to greet. Gabriel claimed he went to bed at his usual hour around 11:30. He insisted he had performed his customary rounds, locking doors, checking windows, spending a few moments alone in the family's small prayer room before retiring to his master bedroom, the same room he had occupied alone since the death of his wife on their journey west years before. What transpired between that moment and sunrise on October 13th has remained the subject of endless speculation, investigation, and whispered debate. Gabriel swore he slept soundly, heard nothing, saw nothing, and by morning, his entire world had changed. Yet nothing could have prepared anyone for the chilling physical evidence uncovered the following morning, evidence that hinted at carefully orchestrated movements throughout the house, all while one man slept unknowingly just a few doors away. The transformation of the Thornfield disappearance from a private family matter into a national obsession began at dawn on October 13th. That morning, as sunlight struggled to pierce the heavy Selkerk fog, Mrs. Caldwell arrived to begin her usual routine, preparing breakfast and ensuring the household stirred to life. Her key turned smoothly in the front door. Just as she had left it the night before, the lock was secure. She entered expecting to hear the gentle chaos of a large family, waking the thud of footsteps overhead, the clink of teacups, laughter voices calling down stairwells. But instead, silence. An unnatural, almost oppressive stillness. Later, Mrs. Caldwell would describe it as walking into a tomb. No footsteps, no greetings, not even the familiar tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway or the sigh of the old wooden beams. Even the air felt still, too still. At first, she assumed the family had overslept, perhaps the result of late-night conversation or the unusual chill that had settled over Selkerk overnight. But concern began to grow when she reached the kitchen. Every evening around 10:00 p.m., the sisters would gather there for their habitual late-night snack. A pot of tea, a plate of biscuits, a quiet exchange about the day's events. It was a ritual as regular as the sunrise. But on this morning, the kitchen sat exactly as she had left it the night before, untouched. Pristine. No crumbs, no dishes in the drying rack, not a single teacup out of place. Now alarmed, Mrs. Caldwell made her way up the main staircase to the second floor. This was where Margaret Catherine and the twins had their rooms. The hallway was still. None of the doors stood ajar, which was odd. They were always slightly open in the mornings, part of the usual hum of daily life beginning. She knocked gently on Margaret's door. No answer. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned the knob and stepped inside. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. Margaret's bedroom looked as if no one had touched it. Not just overnight, but ever. The bed was perfectly made, its corners folded with the almost surgical precision Margaret was known for. The pillows aligned just so. The coverlet smooth and taut, not a single wrinkle marring its surface. Her nightgown still hung on its usual hook near the window untouched. Her brush and comb sat neatly beside a small stack of books and lesson plans for the next day's classes. Everything appeared orderly, proper, Margaret-like. But to Mrs. Caldwell, who had tended this room for years, something was unmistakably wrong. The precision was off. Subtly. A book shelved out of order. The papers on Margaret's desk disturbed, restacked, but not by Margaret. Someone had been here. Someone who didn't understand her meticulous system. Catherine's room offered no comfort. Like Margaret's, the bed was untouched. But here the disturbance came not from disorder but from its absence. Catherine, the free-spirited artist, usually left her room in a colorful chaos of brushes, paint sketches, and inspiration. Half-finished canvases leaned against walls, pencils rolled across cluttered desks. That morning, everything was unnaturally tidy. Brushes washed and aligned, canvases stacked neatly, paint tubes ordered by color. It was as if someone who had never met Catherine had tried to correct her creative mess into something clinical. It felt sterile, wrong. And then there was the twins' room. Here, Mrs. Caldwell would encounter the most disturbing clues of all. Elela Nena and Elizabeth had always maintained their room with identical precision, every brush, garment and letter arranged in a mirror-perfect symmetry that spoke of their inseparable bond. But on the morning of their disappearance, that symmetry had been violated. Someone had entered the room and tried without success to restore order after a methodical search. Dresser drawers had been opened and reclosed, their contents handled and returned, but not in the precise configurations the twins unfailingly maintained. What remained was a subtle dissonance, a perfect world disrupted by an intruder who did not fully understand the rules of its order. Mrs. Caldwell's horror deepened as she ascended to the 3rd floor and found that the rooms of Sarah Grace and Rebecca told the same impossible story. 3 untouched beds, 3 nightgowns still hanging neatly on wardrobe doors, and 3 more chambers bearing the faint fingerprints of a meticulous but ignorant search. Once again, nothing was taken, yet everything had been examined. Her scream, when it finally came, split the silence of Selkerk with such anguish and ferocity that it brought neighbors running from blocks away. She fled the house wild-eyed and shaking, crying out that the girls were gone, vanished without a trace, and that something unthinkable had happened within the supposed safety of their family home. Gabriel Thornfield, jarred from sleep by the growing crowd, and Mrs. Caldwell's shrieks, stumbled out of bed and into disbelief. At first, he waved away the hysteria, certain that some misunderstanding or mischief was at play. But as he rushed room to room, calling his daughters' names, his certainty dissolved into terror. 7 bedrooms stood in eerie stillness. 7 beds unslept in. 7 lives erased without a sound, a struggle, or a single broken lock. Within minutes, Sheriff William Harding arrived. A decade of patrolling the frontier had given him experience with all manner of human conflict. Drunken brawls, livestock disputes, the occasional violent grudge. But the Thornfield case was something else entirely. 7 young women had vanished from a locked house without a sign of forced entry, without a scream, without even a footprint left in the damp soil that surrounded the home. It was a riddle with no beginning and no end. Harding's first sweep of the house confirmed what Mrs. Caldwell and Gabriel already knew. Every door and window was locked from the inside. There were no broken panes, no forced latches. The back gate remained bolted. The soft earth at the foundation showed no indentations, no scuff marks, no indication that anyone had approached the house, let alone exited it with 7 women in tow. More unsettling still, the signs of intrusion were unmistakable, but puzzlingly restrained. Each bedroom had been searched with care. Personal effects had been examined and put back clothing. Refolded jewelry returned to its box diaries and letters stacked neatly again. Yet, nothing was missing. Gold lockets remained in plain view. Coins were left untouched. Even deeply personal mementos, objects of sentimental value, known only to the sisters, were undisturbed. It was as if the intruder had been searching for something, not material, something abstract or hidden, and had found it or failed to. With no physical evidence to guide him, Sheriff Harding began his investigation the only way he could, by questioning the people of Selkerk one by one. From the lamplighters to the boarding house, matrons from the station master to the school children, he asked about the night of October 12th and the first light of October 13th. Had anyone seen a figure on the street? A carriage passing after curfew? A lantern in a second-story window where none should have been? And quietly, with growing unease, the townspeople began to speak. What emerged from these interviews was a quiet thread of dread, a pattern of odd occurrences and unspoken tensions that had built gradually through the summer and early autumn of 1899. Residents of Selkerk, though hesitant to speak plainly at first, slowly began to acknowledge a shared sense of unease that had been growing long before the sisters vanished. It wasn't a single incident or obvious event that had set it in motion. Rather, it was a tapestry of strange visitors, secret messages, and quiet disruptions that in hindsight painted a disturbing portrait of a town under silent siege. Multiple townsfolk recalled seeing unfamiliar well-dressed strangers arriving on the evening trains in the weeks before the disappearances. These men, always in expensive Eastern clothing, their boots polished to a mirror, shine their leather luggage marked with fine brass trim, conducted brief, discreet meetings with Selkerk's most prominent citizens. Then they vanished on the morning trains, just as quietly as they had come. They never stayed to share a drink at the tavern, never attended Sunday services, never took part in the usual neighborly exchanges that were customary in tight-knit frontier towns. They were ghosts in tailored suits, and their aloofness only made them more memorable. The telegraph office soon became another focus of Sheriff Harding's investigation. There Timothy Fletcher, the soft-spoken night clerk, confessed to seeing an unusual spike in activity during that same period. Dozens of coded messages had been dispatched, always late at night, always addressed to anonymous recipients in far-off cities: Chicago, New York, San Francisco. The contents were meaningless to Fletcher, long strings of numbers, letters, and symbols that defied all logic. Yet it was clear that they carried urgent meaning to someone. Most of the coded telegrams had been sent by none other than Gabriel Thornfield himself. Others were sent by figures whose names carried weight in the region: respected business owners, land agents, even the town's bank president, Charles Whitman, president of the Selkerk First Bank, and one of the town's most guarded men, initially bristled at Harding's inquiries. But under continued pressure, and as the magnitude of the mystery deepened, Whitman admitted that Thornfield's banking activity had raised red flags well before the disappearances. Over the past 6 months, Gabriel had made a series of unusually large withdrawals, gold coins, no paper, and no formal explanations. The timing of these withdrawals aligned exactly with the visits from the mysterious Eastern men. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. More troubling than the withdrawals were the deposits, sizable payments arriving from unknown parties in the East, regular and increasing in size. These payments were not linked to the general store's earnings, which had been modest by every other account. Even allowing for Selkerk's economic upswing from nearby silver mining activity, Gabriel's wealth accumulation didn't make sense. His books told a story of money multiplying in ways that frontier commerce simply couldn't explain. And none of it had been reported to the territorial tax assessors. As the first snow settled over Selkerk and the case reached national attention, the town became a lightning rod for journalists, federal agents, and curious thrill seekers. Newspapers from coast to coast ran sensational front-page stories. The mystery of the Thornfield sisters had everything a restless public could crave: beauty, innocence, vanishing women, a suspicious father-coded telegrams, and whispers of Eastern corruption, reaching deep into the wild heart of Montana. Artists' renditions of the sisters, delicate, angelic, tragic, were etched alongside wild theories of secret societies, railroad barons, or dark rites carried out in lonely places. Soon the federal government dispatched Inspector Marcus Reed of the Department of Justice to take over the investigation. Reed was no stranger to complex cases. With a background in dismantling criminal networks that operated across state and territorial lines, his reputation was one of sharp discipline and grim tenacity. His arrival marked a turning point in the case. This was no longer a local mystery. It was in the eyes of Washington a matter of national concern. Reed wasted no time. Within days, he had secured Gabriel Thornfield's complete business records and began a meticulous audit. What he uncovered was far beyond what even Sheriff Harding had suspected. Gabriel's finances weren't just suspicious, they were damning. The deposits from the East showed signatures linked to known intermediaries for organized criminal enterprises groups that had long been suspected of laundering money through frontier enterprises where scrutiny was minimal. Gabriel's store had all the trappings of a laundering operation disguised as a modest family business, and the timing of the largest payments always within days of one of the stranger's visits, always followed by a coded telegram. There was more too much to ignore. Patterns emerged. Property transfers, land deeds changing hands without clear buyers, quiet expansions of credit, and most notably, the silent disappearance of physical documents from the town's registry building. Reed began connecting Gabriel Thornfield not just to illicit finances, but to a far-reaching network that possibly involved land fraud, bribery, and the smuggling of silver and cultural artifacts to Eastern collectors. But as damning as the evidence was, it still failed to answer the central question: what had happened to the sisters? The investigation was only beginning to unravel the edges of the conspiracy. And as winter deepened and snow buried the trails that might once have held footprints, one truth loomed larger than all others. Gabriel Thornfield was no ordinary father, and Selkerk was no longer just a sleepy mining town. It was a stage upon which something vast, cruel, and deliberate had unfolded. And 7 sisters had vanished without a sound. It was not until the spring of 1923, nearly 24 years after the Thornfield sisters vanished into legend, that the case was violently pulled from the shadows of memory. In the heart of a bustling Chicago neighborhood far removed from the snowy silence of Selkerk, a renovation crew working beneath the foundation of a condemned boarding house uncovered a hidden chamber. Inside, amidst the crumbling stone and mildew, they found ledgers bearing Gabriel Thornfield's unmistakable signature maps of western mining corridors, marked in red ink, and most chilling of all, 7 delicate lockets, each inscribed with the name of a Thornfield daughter. The discovery set off a cascade of federal inquiries, newspaper hysteria, and whispered rumors in political circles that feared what might be unearthed next. For it was now clear whatever had happened in Selkerk in 1899 had not ended there. The truth had not been buried. It had merely been waiting. Let me know if you'd like a continuation into 1923 Chicago, or if you're planning a twist ending or a historical horror narrative from here. Here's a rewritten version of your passage that enhances its mystery flow and emotional resonance while keeping the tone and length in line with your original script and the sleepy history tales style. Gabriel Thornfield's astonishing rise in wealth began not with hard work or ingenuity, but with secrets, signatures, and silence. His prosperity coincided almost exactly with a murky sequence of land transfers, railroad grants, and mining rights that conveniently flowed in his favor. But the real rot ran deeper. Investigators soon uncovered ties between Gabriel and a shadowy financial syndicate known only as the Rocky Mountain Development Company. To most, it was a name whispered in courtrooms and backrooms never in the open. To federal agents, it was a specter with no face. The company was a bureaucratic labyrinth hidden behind a smokescreen of subsidiaries, shell corporations, and straw agents. Its true owners were ghosts untraceable, unreachable, and rich beyond comprehension. Its strategy, a quiet but relentless takeover of the West's mineral wealth. It moved like a parasite, buying up claims, seducing politicians, rewarding silence, and punishing scrutiny. Local authorities, either underpaid or in someone's pocket, were powerless to intervene. What little Agent Reed could confirm was damning. Gabriel's alliance with the syndicate seemed to begin shortly after he arrived in Selkerk, when a mysterious infusion of investment capital appeared in his ledgers, an amount too large, too sudden, and too convenient to explain away. In exchange, he became their man on the inside, feeding the organization detailed intelligence on Selkerk's underground riches, shifting land titles, and the political winds that might tip opportunity one way or another. As winter swallowed the Montana hills and the search for the 7 Thornfield sisters drifted from desperate to dormant, the town began to quietly fracture. Families uncomfortable with federal eyes on their affairs packed up and left their wagons heavy with unease. In their place came newcomers, strangers with no memory of the missing girls, no investment in the truth, and no desire to question their benefactors. Gabriel, once a civic fixture, receded into the shadows of his mansion. He ventured out only to visit the town cemetery where he had placed 7 headstones, each name carved in marble, each grave empty. His once vibrant general store was sold to distant buyers who knew nothing of the tragedies it had witnessed. When they attempted to review the store's financial records, they found the ledgers gutted, the archives stripped clean. Whatever had transpired in Gabriel's books had been buried along with his reputation. Time, ever loyal to forgetting, did its work. The sisters' clothes were stored in attic trunks and left to mildew. Their poetry, their sketches, their music, all replaced by cakewalk socials and sewing clubs hosted by newcomers eager to build a future with no ghosts. By the spring of 1901, most of Selkerk's original families were gone. What remained was a town gutted of memory, rebuilt by strangers who had no reason to mourn what they never knew. The warmth of neighborly trust had cooled into opportunistic detachment. Selkerk had once been a place of shared burdens and borrowed sugar. Now, it was a railroad pit stop, a company town in waiting. And in that transformation, Selkerk mirrored a larger story unfolding across the American West, the closing of the frontier, not with fanfare, but with foreclosure notices. Idealism replaced by industry. Hope hollowed out by men in faraway offices who saw mountains not as homes, but as ore. And so 23 years after 7 sisters vanished, and a town was reshaped by what it refused to confront. It was not in Selkerk, but in the basement of a condemned building in Chicago that the past finally clawed its way back into the light. In the spring of 1922, as demolition crews worked to bring down an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's south side, they struck something unexpected. Behind a false wall sealed tight and forgotten for decades was a hidden chamber. The room was choked with dust, but otherwise untouched, an eerie time capsule preserved in silence. Inside, dozens of filing cabinets and storage crates formed a paper trail of wrought ledgers, letters, personal effects, evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated unchecked through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among the artifacts was a collection of 7 small photographs, each carefully labeled, each showing one of the Thornfield sisters. The poses were formal, the lighting professional, clear signs that these were studio portraits, not family mementos. But what unsettled investigators most was not the images themselves, but when they had been taken. The girls were older, Margaret appeared to be in her 30s, her youthful cheer replaced by the stern gravity of a woman burdened by responsibility. Catherine was dressed in expensive clothing, the kind worn by women of means. But her eyes held something that money couldn't disguise, a weariness, a sadness that whispered of betrayal. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth had been photographed separately. Their once matching smiles had diverged with time, shaped by separate paths and different fates. They were still beautiful but strangers to each other now. Sarah sat stiffly in formal attire, perhaps still involved in religious or charitable work, but her face betrayed her. She looked like someone who had waited too long for something that never arrived. Grace's image showed her in her professional prime, perhaps a secretary, a clerk, a school teacher. But her bright mind seemed muted, her spark dimmed. Life had not been kind. And then there was Rebecca, still young, still beautiful, but the light in her face was gone. The girl who once brought laughter to Selkerk was now a woman who knew too much about sorrow. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department had been overseeing the demolition as part of a broader investigation into organized crime. He knew immediately that these photographs were more than relics. They were evidence of a system, of a network of lives rewritten by other people's profit. The files alongside the photographs told a story as methodical as it was monstrous. The women had been part of what the perpetrators called a domestic placement service, a grotesque euphemism that cloaked exploitation in the language of charity and opportunity. The organization's records were meticulous, spanning decades, detailing their operations with the cold precision of accountants and bureaucrats. They targeted poor frontier families under the guise of offering social advancement for their daughters. But behind the curtain was a machine, a multi-tentacled organization operating under dozens of names and front companies. On paper, it looked like a network of employment bureaus, matrimonial services, educational institutions, and charitable agencies. In reality, it was a trafficking operation run like a business empire. Families were studied, pressured, and manipulated, especially those isolated by geography, weakened by poverty, or desperate for a future they couldn't afford. Since at least 1885, the organization had used forged documents, false promises, and the appearance of respectability to lure girls into a system that never intended to give them back. By the time law enforcement caught wind of the operation, it had already moved through the shadows of hundreds of small towns, thriving in places where communication was poor and justice moved slowly if at all. And Selkerk had been one of many. But what the Thornfields never knew, what no one in town ever truly grasped, was that the strangers who came offering scholarships and jobs had already decided their daughters' futures long before the ink dried. In the spring of 1922, during the dismantling of a long-abandoned warehouse on Chicago's forgotten South Side, a crew of construction workers broke through a false wall and stepped into a room that time had hidden for nearly 4 decades. Dust-laden and silent. The chamber was crammed with rusting filing cabinets, crumbling storage boxes, and strange personal effects. Together, they told the story of a criminal empire that had flourished quietly, invisibly, across the American frontier during the waning years of the 19th century and well into the dawn of the 20th. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was a series of 7 small photographs. Each captured one of the Thornfield sisters, posed, composed, and hauntingly alive, years after their supposed disappearance from the quiet town of Selkerk, Montana. The photographs weren't casual snapshots. These were portraits studio quality, with perfect lighting and unnerving clarity. They were accompanied by typed dossiers, pages of information outlining each sister's background, talents, temperament, even physical measurements. These weren't sentimental mementos, they were inventories, as if someone had catalogued the sisters for a reason that had nothing to do with love. Most disturbingly, the girls were pictured at ages they had never reached during their lives in Selkerk. Margaret, the eldest, looked to be in her 30s, her once youthful face hardened by experience. Catherine appeared regal in a gown of wealth and status, yet her eyes told another story, one written in grief. The twins Eleanor and Elizabeth were separated in the photos. Their once matching expressions now diverged, shaped by lives lived apart. Sarah's image portrayed the garb of a religious woman, yet her solemn gaze betrayed the depth of hope. Grace, frozen in her mid-20s, wore professional attire, but her lively spark had dimmed. And Rebecca, the heart of the Thornfield family, was pictured a young woman elegant and proper, yet missing the radiant laughter that once made her unforgettable. Detective John Sullivan, assigned to investigate the warehouse discovery as part of a broader crackdown on organized crime, immediately understood the gravity of what he'd found. These weren't isolated curiosities. These were remnants of a vast, deliberate system. A network that had operated for decades under a mask of respectability. The archive revealed the machinery of a chilling enterprise. A syndicate that referred to itself almost mockingly as a provider of domestic placement services and social advancement opportunities. Behind those euphemisms hid a business that profited from human vulnerability, particularly the dreams and fears of families clinging to survival in the harsh landscapes of the American West. Their operations were clever, sophisticated, merciless. The group targeted frontier families, especially those isolated by geography or circumstance. Families with daughters, bright hopeful, and trapped by poverty. They built a network of businesses from employment agencies to religious missions, even charitable institutions. All of it served as camouflage. And now, dear viewers, as we wander deeper into this forgotten archive, I want to thank those of you who have stood by sleepy history tales. Your companionship through these long-shadowed corridors of the past means more than you know. But there are many still walking beside us in silence, those who haven't yet subscribed or left a trace in the comments. If that's you, consider joining us more openly. Every shared thought helps this story reach more souls. Now let's return to the shadowy roots of the Thornfield tragedy. The scheme always began with a visitor. Polished shoes, clean collars, gentle smiles. Strangers from the East who arrived bearing credentials, recommendations, and generous promises. They claimed to represent elite schools, religious charities, or prosperous employers seeking virtuous young women for roles in cities brimming with opportunity. To the weary families of the frontier, these men and women seemed like saviors. They promised tuition-free education, proper boarding, good pay. For parents watching their daughters fade into obscurity, the offer was irresistible. But the truth was never so kind. Once a family expressed interest, they were slowly entangled. First came paperwork, then requests for modest financial investments, donations to schools, shares in businesses, fees for placement processing. Each step made withdrawal more difficult. Pride, hope, debt, all tangled like vines around their feet. The recruiters were masters at sensing where to press. A family crushed by debt might be offered a profitable investment. A father concerned about his daughter's future might be shown enrollment forms from a prestigious academy. A mother anxious about social standing might be assured that her girl would dine with the refined, and when the day came, when the girl left home, it was always wrapped in ritual. Farewells, train tickets, city names whispered like promises. Sometimes the girl believed she was heading to college or work. Sometimes she thought she was running toward freedom. Either way, she rarely came back. In the case of the Thornfields, the roots went far deeper than anyone in Selkerk had dared imagine. Detective Sullivan's findings included letters between the criminal syndicate and none other than Gabriel Thornfield himself. They dated back to 1893, just a year after Gabriel had first arrived in Montana. Those early letters revealed a man whose quick rise in business had not been chance. It had been purchased. Gabriel, it turned out, was their man in Montana. At first, he merely offered names, families with too many mouths to feed, girls with talent and no prospects. He provided introductions, wrote recommendations, vouched for the recruiters. But it didn't stop there. By the end of the decade, Gabriel was no longer just a scout. He was dependent. The organization fed his expansion. They paid off his debts. They shielded him from rivals. And then, when the noose began to tighten, when federal agents took interest and locals grew suspicious, they demanded payment, not in money, in daughters, his own. The letters found in that dusty warehouse tell the story of a man unraveling. Gabriel pleaded, bargained, offered alternatives, anything to spare his children. But the organization had no sympathy. To them, it was a simple balance sheet. They had invested in Gabriel Thornfield, and now it was time for him to repay the debt. They reminded him gently what would happen if he refused. Bankruptcy, scandal, lawsuits, worse. Gabriel tried to find a way out. He explored every possibility, but the walls were already closing in, and so the dominoes fell, one by one. The sinister machinery of the operation typically began with the arrival of well-dressed, soft-spoken strangers, gentlemen who claimed to represent Eastern businesses, elite boarding schools, and charitable societies. They came bearing crisp credentials, letters signed by notable figures, and detailed proposals that promised young women a future far beyond the harsh limits of frontier life. To parents weary from drought debt and isolation, these offers seemed heaven-sent chances for their daughters to rise above the dust-choked towns and endless toil. But as families expressed interest, they were gradually ensnared in a tightening web. What began with a hopeful handshake often ended in complicated contracts, financial entanglements, and social commitments that became impossible to unravel. By the time unease crept in, it was too late. The organization had expertly identified each family's soft spot. Some were lured by dreams of respectability. Others were driven by fear that their daughters would wither in obscurity, forgotten in the backwoods of Montana or Utah. At the final stage, the daughters were removed, entirely plucked from their homes under the guise of scholarships, apprenticeships, or marriage offers in distant cities. The deception was so complete that some young women believed they were embarking on grand careers, while their families were told the girls had chosen new lives in glamorous urban worlds. Few suspected that these departures were orchestrated with surgical precision, by a vast, invisible network. Detective Sullivan's breakthrough in the Thornfield case uncovered something far darker than anyone had expected. Hidden within the old estate's cellar archives was correspondence stretching back to 1893, just a year after Gabriel Thornfield arrived in Montana. These letters told a harrowing truth. Gabriel's wealth, his land, and his reputation had all been purchased not with honest labor, but with complicity. He had not just been a victim, he had been a participant. In the beginning, his involvement seemed innocuous. He wrote recommendations vouched for visiting agents and passed along information about local families. But as the organization saw his intelligence, his growing influence, and his desperate need for funding, they elevated him. By 1899, with federal investigators closing in and townsfolk whispering of strangers and shady dealings, Gabriel was no longer an asset. He was a liability, and the price of his success came due. They demanded the unthinkable, his own daughters, 7 of them. Gabriel's final letters are among the most devastating artifacts discovered in this case. You can feel the ink bleed with desperation. He begged, bargained, even suggested fleeing to another state. He promised more money, more girls from other families. But the response was cold and final. Only the surrender of his own daughters would wipe his debt clean. He was told they would be treated well, married off to cultured gentlemen, given opportunities they could never dream of in Montana. He clung to that promise like a dying man, clutching rosary beads, hoping against hope that they would live, maybe even forgive him. Just when we think this tale couldn't twist further into darkness, it does. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this shadowy road with us. At Sleepy History Tales, we're endlessly grateful for those who have subscribed and stayed by our side. But there are still many who listen in the quiet who haven't yet hit that subscribe button. If this story gripped you, if your heart ached for the Thornfield daughters, show your support. Like this video, share it with a fellow lover of eerie history and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We're only just beginning. The fallout from the discovery of Gabriel's correspondence was immediate and seismic. Federal agencies launched sweeping investigations, not just in Montana, but across the American West. Detective Sullivan's findings had pulled back the curtain on a criminal empire that had operated in near-total secrecy for decades. What began as a mystery about 7 missing girls became a nationwide reckoning. The organization's reach was staggering. Investigators uncovered evidence of deep systemic corruption. Judges bought off to dismiss cases. Sheriffs paid to turn away desperate parents. And most chilling of all politicians, those who had built careers preaching morality and law were directly involved. Some had even helped draft laws that made it harder for families to report their daughters missing. The hypocrisy was sickening. These men who spoke of virtue and civilization had trafficked young women from the shadows. They wore smiles in the Senate and left ruin in remote towns. Through bank ledgers and telegrams, the scope of the conspiracy came into view. Between 1885 and 1910, more than 300 young women were trafficked through this network. They were chosen not just for beauty, but for their obedience, education, or status as only daughters' traits that made them desirable in the grotesque economics of illegal marriage markets. Technology played its part. The railroads, those shining symbols of progress, were silent accomplices. Trains ferried victims across state lines with chilling efficiency. Meanwhile, the remoteness of frontier towns and the slowness of 19th century communication systems kept grieving families trapped in confusion and helplessness. And so the organization thrived. But now, with the veil lifted, a reckoning had begun. Gabriel Thornfield had written letter after letter, desperately exploring every possible path to save his daughters. He offered more money. He suggested offering other families' daughters instead, an idea both pitiful and chilling in its desperation. He even proposed relocating his entire family to another state far beyond the organization's reach. But the response was always the same: surrender the girls or lose everything. The final entries in Gabriel's correspondence, written mere days before the sisters vanished, were filled with dread and resignation. He had accepted the price, hoping against hope that his daughters might live and one day perhaps forgive him. The organization had promised they would be cared for, married to wealthy men, and granted a life of comfort they could never have imagined in rural Montana. Of course, that was a lie. And just when we thought this tragic tale had reached its darkest depths, it plunged even deeper. Before we continue, we want to say thank you to every loyal viewer of Sleepy History Tales. Your presence makes this strange, shadowy journey worth every step. But we've noticed something. Many of you are walking beside us in silence, enjoying the darkness. Yet you haven't hit that subscribe button. If this tale sends a chill down your spine, now is the time. Join our growing circle and share this mystery with someone else who dares to explore it. Now, let's descend further into this abyss. Gabriel's letters didn't just confirm the girl's fate, they pulled back the curtain on a monstrous conspiracy. A secret criminal enterprise operating across the American West, hiding in plain sight and destroying lives on an industrial scale. Detective Sullivan's discovery didn't just explain what had happened to the Thornfield sisters, it unraveled a massive network that had operated for decades under the noses of lawmen, politicians, and even the public itself. As federal investigators dug deeper, what they found shook the very foundation of American trust in its institutions. Judges had been bribed or blackmailed into silence. Sheriffs and marshals accepted regular payouts to bury missing persons reports and intimidate grieving families. And in the most disturbing twist of all, prominent congressmen and business leaders had actively participated in this vile operation. These self-declared champions of morality, these men who spoke of family law and honor, had enriched themselves through the destruction of hundreds of innocent young lives. Over 300 young women aged 14 to 26 were trafficked from frontier communities in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California between 1885 and 1910. Each was hand-picked, chosen for her beauty, her skill, or her family's vulnerability. How could something so massive go unnoticed for so long? The answer lies in the nature of frontier life. Vast distances, limited communication, isolated towns with few resources. It was the perfect hunting ground, and technology ironically made it worse. The railroads that were supposed to unite the country had instead become arteries of evil, transporting victims far from the people who might have fought for them. But this horror wasn't just about geography. It was about human weakness. The organization thrived by preying on poverty and hopelessness. They knew exactly how to approach desperate families, how to offer just enough hope, just enough comfort to coax them toward disaster. What began as a promise of education, marriage, or opportunity quickly became a death sentence or worse. Even in Selkerk, the Thornfield's own town, opinions were split. Some residents demanded justice. Others wanted silence. Why? Because many had profited. Gabriel Thornfield's investments had lifted the town's economy. His prosperity had brought infrastructure jobs growth. And so, when the time came to ask questions, some chose not to ask at all. The mayor, the banker, local merchants. Their names appeared in the ledgers of bribery and cover-ups. And then came the most haunting revelation of all. In Selkerk's cemetery stood 7 pristine marble headstones. Everyone believed they marked the tragic, unexplained deaths of the Thornfield daughters. But the truth, the dates carved into the stones were not death dates. They were the dates of placement. The days each girl was shipped away to a life of servitude and forced marriage in distant cities. Gabriel had known. He had known it all. The headstones weren't memorials. They were records of betrayal. And yet, he said nothing. He built a lie around himself, convincing the town and perhaps himself that he was a heartbroken father, not a man who had sold his daughters to preserve his own legacy. After his suicide in Denver, a note was discovered. In it, Gabriel described the guilt that had driven him mad and confirmed he had known where the girls were. He had held on to information that might have led to their rescue, but he said nothing because silence was safer. By 1922, investigators realized that the organization hadn't died with Gabriel. It had evolved, grown smarter, like a snake shedding its skin. It now masqueraded as legitimate employment agencies, matrimonial services, social clubs. On the surface, they seemed clean, but underneath, the same twisted machinery, and their prey had shifted. No longer isolated farm girls, but now immigrants. The urban poor. Families broken by industrialization, war, and displacement. When the final operation began, over 200 federal agents launched coordinated raids across 12 states, targeting warehouses, front companies, and secret holding facilities. And among their missions was one urgent question: were any of the original victims still alive? The raids yielded evidence that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations. In darkened parlors and locked back rooms across 12 states, agents uncovered not just crimes, but an entire architecture of evil. Dozens of women were liberated from hidden rooms, private estates, and so-called homes for wayward girls, where they had been held in various forms of involuntary servitude. Many had not been seen by their families in decades. Others had been presumed dead. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came in the form of boxes of ledgers, letters, and contracts. Records, names, hundreds of them, each carefully catalogued, each tied to a human life that had vanished. The files included extensive documentation on the Thornfield sisters and the fates they had suffered since disappearing from Selkerk nearly 23 years earlier. Margaret Thornfield, investigators learned, had been shipped to Cleveland. There she had been forced into marriage with Harrison Pembroke, a wealthy steel mill magnate who had specifically requested a wife with educational credentials and cultural refinement. The proposal had been framed to Margaret as a prestigious match, an opportunity to live in an elegant city, pursue intellectual passions, and teach at a well-funded academy. The reality could not have been more different. Pembroke had treated Margaret as a decorative trophy, a possession meant to impress his peers and produce heirs with cultivated mannerisms. She bore him 3 children, but was forbidden from writing letters, contacting her family, or even revealing her real name. Her children grew up believing their mother had no past, an orphan with no kin. Her home was comfortable, yes, but also guarded, surveilled, and suffocating. Attempts to flee had failed. Pembroke's wealth and his ties to the trafficking network ensured that Margaret remained watched at all times. Still, she resisted quietly. She kept journals in secret, documenting every degrading moment and every whispered conversation. Her writings would later become crucial to the investigation, laying bare the inner workings of the operation and pointing investigators toward dozens of other missing women. Catherine's fate had been no less tragic. She had been taken to Milwaukee and placed in the household of Augustus Richardson, a wealthy art collector with a cruel ambition. Richardson had wanted a wife whose creative talents could be harnessed for profit and prestige. He forced Catherine to paint under his name, selling her works in galleries while keeping her confined to a gilded cage of isolation. The mansion was full of her art, masterfully executed, deeply emotional and chilling in its intensity. Hidden among portraits of aristocrats and dreamscapes were unmistakable clues, blurred figures in the corners, longing gazes, hands pressed against invisible barriers. Catherine, who now lived under the name Caroline Phillips, had poured her anguish into her work. Her paintings told the story she could not say aloud, a story of entrapment, of spiritual dismemberment. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been deliberately separated. It was no accident. The traffickers had understood their bond and sought to break it immediately. Eleanor was sent to St. Louis and installed in the home of Marcus Whitfield, a businessman who wanted a wife to run his affairs with practical discipline. But Eleanor was never the same without her sister. The loneliness became unbearable. Within months, she suffered a complete mental breakdown. Neighbors would later recall seeing her wandering the estate grounds, barefoot at night, murmuring Elizabeth's name. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had been taken to Chicago, where she was forced into marriage with Samuel Henderson, a banker, who cared for nothing but appearances and efficiency. He admired her frontier resilience, but offered no affection. She was worked hard, denied friends, and never allowed to inquire about her family. Each sister had been reshaped to serve a purpose. But none of them had truly broken. Each had survived in her own way, through silence, through writing, through art, or sheer endurance. And now, after 2 decades in the shadows, their voices were finally being heard. The Thornfield mystery, once thought to be a tragic footnote in a forgotten town, had become a window into something far larger. What had started in Selkerk was merely one branch of a national network, one that had adapted, evolved, and modernized. What was once a hidden frontier trade had become a quiet, institutional machine, hiding in plain sight. And for the first time, the machine was breaking down. The loss of her sister and the harrowing years that followed transformed Elizabeth Thornfield from the bright, confident young woman once known in Selkerk into a shadow of herself. Withdrawn, weary, and chronically fearful, She moved through life as if expecting punishment at every turn. Investigators discovered a chilling detail. Both Elizabeth and her twin had been told the other was dead. It was no accident, no miscommunication. It was part of a calculated tactic designed by the Trafficking organization, one of many cruel tools used to break bonds that might inspire resistance or escape. Hope was not simply denied. It was surgically removed. Sarah's fate proved to be among the most devastating pieces of the entire case. She had been transported to Detroit and placed into a forced marriage with Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a highly respected minister in the community. Morrison had submitted a request for a wife with musical talent and a religious upbringing, and the organization had delivered. To the public, Morrison played the part of a loving husband and pious leader. Behind closed doors, he exploited Sarah's talents to elevate his own reputation, forcing her to perform at church services and society events while controlling every aspect of her life. Official records claimed Sarah died of pneumonia in 1905. But the investigation uncovered a far darker truth. Years of psychological torment and physical abuse had ravaged her health. When she fell ill, Morrison reportedly withheld medical care, seeing her death not as tragedy, but as an opportunity to request a replacement wife through the same organization. Grace, whose gift for mathematics had been evident from childhood, was deemed highly valuable by the Trafficking network. She was placed with Theodore Blackston, a powerful Chicago businessman who kept her in isolation while using her talents to manage his web of financial crimes. Grace was forced to assist in laundering money and fabricating investment portfolio schemes that enriched Blackston while devastating the lives of countless innocent victims. But Grace did not surrender easily. The investigation revealed she had attempted to sabotage Blackston's operations, inserting subtle errors into financial records in hopes of drawing the attention of authorities. Her quiet rebellion, once discovered, led to brutal punishment. Over time, her spirit and health deteriorated. She died during childbirth in 1909 alone and denied proper care by a man who saw her not as a wife, but as a tool discarded the moment she became inconvenient. Then there was Rebecca. Of all the Thornfield sisters, hers may have been the most haunting story of all. Too young to be placed upon her abduction, she was shuffled between holding facilities like livestock were housed until she came of age and became marketable. These early years were marked by forced isolation, constant relocation, and the emotional devastation of being ripped from her family and denied any chance at stability. By the time Rebecca was considered old enough for placement, her physical and psychological condition had deteriorated so drastically that the organization deemed her unfit for sale. She was discarded, abandoned to a facility where unusable victims were sent to wait out their final days, far from care, far from dignity. In 1907, she died of tuberculosis. She was only 16. The 1922 arrests sparked a media firestorm. The trials that followed revealed not only the full scope of the Thornfield tragedy, but exposed the grotesque infrastructure that had sustained this trafficking empire for nearly 4 decades across the American frontier. Newspapers across the country splashed every gruesome detail across their front pages, igniting a national outcry that led to sweeping reforms in law enforcement, federal oversight, and women's protection laws. At the center of the storm stood Marcus Peyton, the man behind it all. He was arrested in dramatic fashion at his opulent Chicago estate. The raid uncovered a trove of incriminating documents, coded ledgers, and perhaps most damning, a network of political and financial connections that had allowed his empire to thrive unchecked for decades. Peyton's trial was as sensational as it was sickening. Calm, composed, and utterly devoid of remorse, he testified with the poise of a businessman defending a legitimate enterprise. He referred to his network as a service and to the women he trafficked as frontier stock, a phrase that chilled even the most seasoned observers in the courtroom. His complete lack of empathy, his pride in the efficient design of his criminal operation, revealed the sociopathic nature that had made his empire possible. 17 of his top associates were convicted alongside him, charged with crimes ranging from kidnapping and human trafficking to the bribery of public officials. But for many, justice felt hollow. No verdict could return what had been stolen from the Thornfield sisters. No sentence could undo decades of abuse. The evidence revealed at trial surpassed anything investigators had imagined. Detailed records uncovered during the raids exposed a sprawling and meticulously organized trafficking network, one that had operated for decades with the silent approval of corrupted officials. While dozens of women were rescued and given a chance to rebuild their lives, many of the perpetrators slipped through the cracks, shielded by destroyed documents, silenced witnesses, or timely and suspicious deaths. A few high-profile names, politicians, judges, businessmen, were publicly disgraced but rarely convicted. Their money and influence offered them a kind of immunity, even as the truth of their complicity unraveled before a horrified nation. At the heart of this reckoning stood the three surviving Thornfield sisters, Margaret, Catherine, and Elizabeth, presented with a cruel dilemma: testify and potentially help dismantle the remnants of the network, or remain silent to protect the fragile lives they had reconstructed under assumed identities. Margaret, now 49 and known as Mary Patterson, chose to speak. She stood in court, composed yet visibly weathered by the weight of 23 years in captivity. Her words were precise, eloquent, and devastating. She described a life of isolation beneath a veneer of respectability, where her every move was watched and her own children kept in ignorance of her true identity. Her testimony was instrumental in shaping future legislation, providing a voice for victims long silenced by fear and shame. More than that, it reminded the public that the consequences of these crimes were not abstract, they were deeply human. Catherine and Elizabeth made a different choice. Catherine. Now Caroline Phillips had built a quiet life in Milwaukee, where her children lived unaware of her past. She feared that revealing the truth would shatter the only stability she had managed to give them. Elizabeth, living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, was still haunted by the emotional scars of her forced separation from her twin Eleanor, whose fate remained a mystery. The trauma had never truly loosened its grip, and the prospect of revisiting those horrors in the public eye was too much to bear. Their decisions were respected. Investigators and even the public came to understand that survival in these cases wasn't always about standing in the spotlight. Sometimes it meant preserving what little peace remained. These women had given enough. They owed no further explanation to anyone. Back in Selkerk, the aftershocks of the Thornfield revelations reshaped the town forever. The community, once proud of its moral foundations, could no longer ignore the rot that had festered beneath its surface. Families moved away. Businesses shuttered. The Thornfield mansion, abandoned since Gabriel's departure, stood as a ghostly ruin until it was demolished in 1925. The land was left bare. No one dared build over it. The family's original headstones, 7 small marble markers lined in quiet succession, were removed. In their place rose a single monument to the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal. May truth finally set you free. It was funded by ordinary citizens across Montana. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers. People moved not just by sorrow but by a desire to remember, to acknowledge what had happened, to make sure it wouldn't happen again. And the ripples didn't stop there. The Thornfield case ignited a national outcry, and for once it led to action. New federal laws were passed demanding tighter regulation of employment agencies and matrimonial brokers. Interstate cooperation between law enforcement agencies became mandatory, supported by new communication protocols and unified databases for missing persons. It marked the beginning of a more modern, more vigilant system of accountability, one shaped in part by the suffering of the Thornfield sisters. History at its most powerful is not found in statues or dusty archives. It lives in the choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The Thornfield women did not ask to be remembered, but they were. Not because they were symbols, but because they were human, and because their story forced a nation to look inward and reckon with what it had allowed to happen in the shadows. The evidence presented during the trials unveiled a network far more intricate and chilling than even the most cynical observers had imagined. It showed how the organization had exploited gaps in the legal system and thrived in the shadows, protected by layers of corruption that reached into courtrooms, boardrooms, and legislative halls. But while a handful of perpetrators faced justice, many others slipped away, shielded by destroyed records, intimidated witnesses, and the sudden suspicious deaths of those who might have exposed the truth. Several well-known judges, politicians, and business leaders who had clearly played a role in the trafficking ring were never charged. They used their influence, money, and legal maneuvering to escape punishment, though they could not escape the stain left on their names. The public revelations destroyed their reputations, and in some cases, their careers, but not their freedom. At the heart of the legal proceedings was a far more personal, agonizing choice. The 3 surviving Thornfield sisters were given a rare opportunity to testify, publicly reclaim their true identities, and confront their past or remain hidden, preserving the fragile lives they had built after decades of captivity. Margaret, now 49 and living under the name Mary Patterson, made the brave and harrowing decision to testify. She stood before packed courtrooms and described in devastating detail her 23 years of enslavement. Her testimony was not only courageous, but transformative, offering a piercing window into the psychological scars of trafficking and laying the foundation for legal reforms that would help protect future victims. Her intelligence, quiet dignity, and unwavering determination made her a symbol of resistance and survival. But Catherine and Elizabeth chose silence. Catherine now, Caroline Phillips, had built a quiet life in Milwaukee with children who had no idea of their mother's true past. She feared that unearthing the truth would destroy her family's peace, inflict pain without healing, and expose them to danger from those who remained loyal to the criminal network. Elizabeth, living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, had never fully recovered from the trauma of being separated from her twin sister. The thought of revisiting that agony publicly was unbearable. She withdrew completely, choosing emotional safety over justice. The investigators did not press them. They understood that justice in this case could never be complete, and that the sisters had already paid more than anyone ever should. Their decision to remain silent reflected a broader tragic truth that for many survivors of trafficking, the choice between justice and survival is not always a choice at all. Sometimes, silence is the only refuge left. The town of Selkerk too bore lasting scars. The revelations hollowed out the community's soul. Once proud families left in quiet shame. Others remained, but could no longer speak of the past. The Thornfield mansion, long abandoned, was finally demolished in 1925. Nothing was ever built in its place. The land was left empty, like a wound that refused to heal. In the town cemetery, the 7 ornate headstones bearing the Thornfield name were replaced with a single stone monument. Its inscription read simply, "To the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal. May truth finally set you free." The new memorial was funded not just by Selkerk's remaining residents, but by people across Montana who had heard the sisters' story and wanted to honor their suffering. It stood not only as a tribute, but as a warning etched in stone for future generations. And the impact of the case rippled outward, reshaping more than just a town. Across the United States, lawmakers passed reforms to increase oversight of employment agencies and so-called matrimonial services. Law enforcement agencies began cooperating more closely across state lines. New systems were created to track missing persons, especially women and children. Investigators trained in how trafficking networks operated and how to identify their victims. But perhaps the most important revelation was not legal, it was moral. The Thornfield case revealed how poverty, isolation, and the thirst for opportunity could make entire communities vulnerable to predators. In the chaos of the American frontier, where law was often miles away and silence was easily bought, criminal enterprises like pitons thrived. They promised dreams. They delivered nightmares. They preyed especially on young women. In places where social customs limited their choices and economic desperation shaped their futures, women and girls often had little say in what became of them. The traffickers understood this. They posed as saviors, offering freedom and futures. What they really offered was a lifetime of degradation, dressed up as hope. The legacy of the 7 sisters did not end with court proceedings or headstones. Their story helped shape the way America understood trafficking, not as a distant evil, but as a domestic threat, hiding in plain sight. The evidence collected during the investigation became the foundation for new strategies to prevent similar crimes. Lawmakers began looking not just at the criminals, but at the conditions that allowed them to operate poverty, neglect, and the dangerous illusion that progress justified any cost. This story, in the end, is not just about the past. It's about the fragile promise of the American dream and what happens when that promise is corrupted by greed. Gabriel Thornfield thought he was offering his daughters a better life. He believed that success, comfort, and marriage into wealth would protect them. But in trusting the wrong hands, he doomed them. His daughters became commodities, youthful, beautiful, innocent, and those qualities, instead of shielding them, became the very things that destroyed them. They were bought and sold, hidden and abused, forgotten by a society more concerned with wealth than justice. And yet, in Margaret's voice, in her willingness to testify, to face her abusers, to demand recognition, something endured. A spark, a refusal to be erased. Her story lit a path for others to follow and helped expose a truth that many had long refused to see. The story of the 7 sisters of Selkerk is not just a historical mystery. It is a parable, a dark reflection of the price we pay when we mistake ambition for virtue and turn away from those who need protection most. Because progress means nothing if it rests on the suffering of the innocent. And true civilization is not measured in wealth or invention, but in our willingness to defend the vulnerable from those who would exploit them for profit. So what do you think really happened in Selkerk? Do you believe we know the full story? Or are there still secrets buried in the dusty files of long-forgotten archives? Some believe the trafficking network was far larger than investigators could prove. Others suspect that similar crimes took place in frontier communities across the West and were never reported at all. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this story haunting and compelling, help us uncover more chapters from America's hidden history. Subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes that the past still has lessons to teach us. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.